Merry Christmas. Really? We're going to find out. We're going to find out scientifically just how merry your Christmas is. So we're going to take a survey. We're going to follow the science today and find out how merry your Christmas is. So I need you, do you have one of those phones where you can get on the internet? If you have one of those, just get it out right now. And I know most of you have them because I looked at you watching them while you're supposed to be paying attention to me. You're checking out your feeds and your Instagram and your TikTok videos. But if you get out your phone, there's going to be a QR code on the screen. You can scan that, or you can go to Menti, menti.com. Now, if you're online, you can join in the survey, menti.com. When you call up that website, it will ask you for a code. And the code numbers are down there at the bottom, 1769-8199. 1769-8199. When you type in that code, or you go to that website and you access a survey, and the survey is going to ask you about how merry you can be at Christmas by ranking the top 5 uses for fruitcake. So when you go onto the website, you will have 5 choices. And what we want you to do is we want you to say, of these 5 things, what is your favorite? That would be number 1. And what is your least favorite? That would be number 5. So you rank them from 5 to 1, least favorite 5, most favorite 1. So when you go on, you'll see the 5 choices for ranking fruitcake, the 5 uses for fruitcake. So once you get on there, you'll see what they are. It's a very serious scientific survey. And as you're doing that, I want to explain something. There are some of you who have been around Riverbend a long time. And you've been here a number of Christmases, and you're thinking right now, you're asking yourself, why every Christmas does Dave rag on fruitcakes? What is up with that? What is his damage? What is going on that every Christmas I come here and Dave throws the fruitcakes under the bus? Why is that? 15 years ago I was here and he was ragging on fruitcakes, and the first time it was pretty funny and I laughed a little bit, but it's worn thin. Get over it, Dave. What did a fruitcake ever do to you? Why do you have to mock fruitcakes and people who like fruitcakes? Why do you have to do it every Christmas? Why? I just need to know why. And that's a perfectly good question. See, we should never be afraid to ask why. We should never be afraid to ask why when someone says, this is what's true or this is what's right. We should say, why? This is what you should believe. This is what you should do. Why? When your kids come to you and they say, I want to do this, you should say, why? Why? You should never be afraid of asking why. Because why gets to the root of things. Why pushes away the clutter and helps us to clarify, to understand. Never be afraid to ask why. And that's why we're being so Christmassy. It's not that we're being Christmassy, it's that we're asking why. Why? Why Rudolph? Why Santa? Why Frosty the Snowman? Why Ebenezer Scrooge? And more importantly, why the story? We're interrogating the familiar Bible story, the story of the birth of Jesus, and we're asking why. Why then? Why there? Why them? Why those? Why these? Why this? Why that? Because we want to get to the heart of the story. And so today, we want to ask the question, why them? Why Mary and Joseph? Why them? Before we ask that question, would you pray with me? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your words spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit to remind us that you delight in doing the extraordinary through ordinary people like us. Pray that we would take that to heart and be encouraged today. Pray that for myself and for my family. and for all of us here. For I ask that in Jesus' name, amen. The story of the birth of Jesus is only told to us in 2 of the 4 Gospels. In Mark and in John, they really don't give us any background on the birth of Jesus. All the information we have about the story of the birth of Jesus comes from Matthew's Gospel and from Luke's Gospel. In fact, the best thumbnail sketch that we have of what we call Christmas, what is the birth of Christ, comes to us from just 8 verses at the beginning of the book of Matthew. The book of Matthew tells us the familiar story. This is his thumbnail sketch of how the world began to change. He says it this way, down in verse 18 of Matthew 1. This is how Jesus the Messiah was born. His mother Mary was engaged to be married to Joseph. But before the marriage took place, while she was still a virgin, she became pregnant through the power of the Holy Spirit. Joseph, to whom she was engaged, was a righteous man and did not want to disgrace her publicly, so he decided to break the engagement quietly. As he considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. Joseph, son of David, the angel said, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child within her was conceived by the Holy Spirit. And she will have a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All of this occurred to fulfill the Lord's message through his prophet. Look, the virgin will conceive a child. She will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. When Joseph woke up, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded and took Mary as his wife. But he did not have sexual relations with her until her son was born, and Joseph named him Jesus. Why them? Why Mary and Joseph? Well, from this simple thumbnail sketch, there are a few things to notice. And 2 of the things that we notice from this story are so obvious we almost overlook them, but they're very significant. There's a 3rd thing I want us to look at, and that's more controversial. It's more unusual. But the first thing I want us to notice is it had to be Mary and Joseph. It had to be Mary and Joseph because they were Hebrew. They were Jews. And Jesus had to be a Jew. He had to be a descendant of Hebrew people. In fact, we know this is true because Matthew begins, before he tells us the story of the birth of Jesus, he gives us Joseph's genealogy, or Jesus bona fides. It gives us his legal standing as a Jew. Now we know biologically Joseph wasn't even the father of Jesus. But in the Jewish tradition, 2,000 years ago, the standing in Judaism, the standing in the Jewish community came legally through the father. If the father was a Jew and the mother was a Gentile, the children were Jews. If the mother was a Jew and the father was Gentiles, the children were not Jewish. So Matthew goes on to explain that Joseph was a descendant of the Jewish people. He's first of all says that he's a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He also goes out of his way in this genealogy to point out that he is a descendant of the great King David. And this is important because Jesus had to be a Jew because of the promises that had been made to Abraham and to David. In Genesis chapter 12, God came to a childless 90-year-old goat herder named Abram and made him a promise. He made a covenant with him. And he said, through you, even though you have no children, all the people of the world will be blessed. I will bless all of the earth through you. And he was a 90-year-old man who had no children. God made a similar promise to David through the prophet Nathan in 1 Chronicles 17. He said, through you, through your descendants, there will be one who I will call my son, and he will call me father. And he will establish my throne and my kingdom forever. And these are promises I make to Abraham and to David. And Jesus was the fulfillment of those prophecies. So Mary and Joseph had to be Hebrews. They had to be Jews because of the promises. That wasn't the only reason they had to be Jewish. They also had to be Jewish because of the Torah law. How do you know if you're a good person? How do you know? What is the metric that you use to determine whether or not you are a significant person or a valuable person or a successful person? I think for most of us, that metric is circumstantial, it's situational, it's contextual. The metric that a junior high boy uses to determine whether he's popular or successful or significant or a good person is very different than the metric that a mature father of a family uses. A person who is in prison has a very different metric for determining what makes them successful or significant or a good person. And so we have a tendency to imagine that this is an arbitrary assignment. It depends on your situation. It depends on your circumstances. But the Torah law was literally carved in stone. It was God saying, you want to know what makes a good person, what makes you successful? Here's 10 commandments. Check off these boxes and you will know. Because these are immutable, unchanging, transcendent values. They really were a reflection of the two great commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. If you want to be a good person, keep those commandments. Mary and Joseph had to be Jewish because Jesus had to be born under the Torah law so that we would know, carved in stone in an immutable fashion, that he was a good person. But that wasn't the only reason. He didn't just have to be a Jew because of the promises. It wasn't just because of the Torah. It was also because of the Levitical law, the Levitical code. You see, there's something that happens when you try to be successful. You know what that happens? You bring into play the possibility of failure. There is no success. There is no such thing as success without the possibility of failure. Unless you are overcoming something, unless you are moving past something that you have to overcome, there is no success. If everything is perfect, if everyone is perfect, then there is no success. In fact, you could say that in the pursuit of success, you must guarantee the possibility of failure. And this is what the law did. Part of the purpose of the Torah law was to reveal our imperfections, was to say, here is the standard, and it exposed our imperfections. And the Levitical code said, here's what you do about it. Here's how you make up for your imperfections. Here's how you remedy failure. Here's how you find forgiveness. Now, 2,000 years ago, even to this day, the Levitical code that guides the pathway to receiving forgiveness is a complicated, almost endless list of requirements and nuances and liturgies and practices and sacrifices depending on certain circumstances. It gets so overwhelming that it's possible for us to forget that at the core of the Levitical law, there is a truth about the nature of forgiveness. And the truth of the nature of forgiveness is this: it always has a cost. There is no forgiveness without a price. If I loan you money and you default on that loan, then the only way for me to forgive you is for me to pay the price and to lose the money that I loaned to you. It doesn't just magically appear back to me when I forgive you. I have to pay the price for your forgiveness. You see, we live in a cause and effect universe. We live in a world that is guided by the law that says for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, which means that if you harm me, according to natural law, according to the law of the universe, I have the right to harm you right back. And the only way that I can break that chain of cause and effect is to take on myself the cost of forgiving you. Sometimes that cost is that I will not seek revenge. I will not seek retribution. I will absorb the loss myself. And the Levitical code taught the people of God and should teach us that forgiveness always has a price. And the dramatic way that the Levitical code showed the people of God what that price was it required of them those things that were most precious. In an agrarian society, it required the things that they lived on. It required their cattle. It required their sheep. It required the portion of their harvest. And they put it on an altar and burned it so that they would know this is what forgiveness costs. In fact, the author of the book of Hebrews reflected on the nature of the Levitical law in Hebrews chapter 4 or Hebrews chapter 9, where the author of Hebrews said, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. The cost is high. See, Jesus had to be born of Mary and Joseph, and Mary and Joseph had to be Hebrew. They had to be Jews so that he could fulfill the promise to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob and to David, so that he could be born under the Torah law, so that he could have an immutable, unchanging standard for this is what makes a person good, and so that he could accomplish forgiveness, so that he would know what the price was to accomplish it. You see, Jesus, Mary and Joseph had to be Hebrew. Last week, when we looked at Galatians chapter 4 said, in the fullness of time, God sent his son, born under the law. But it also says he was born of a woman born under the law. See, the second thing that we notice in Matthew's story of the birth of Jesus is that Mary and Joseph were chosen because they were human, because they were people. You may say, well, no, duh, of course, what's he going to come from a goat? Well, imagine this. Imagine if Jesus just showed up, just out of the Galilean wilderness, and he just did all the things that he did. Could he have walked on the water? Could he have healed the blind? Could he have raised the dead? Could he have taught the things that he taught? He could have done all of those things. But he had to be a human being, like you and me. That's why in Luke chapter 3, there's a second genealogy. Now, we have to get a little technical about this, but biblical scholars have debated for centuries whether or not the genealogy in Luke chapter 3 is an additional genealogy for Joseph, or whether it is in fact possibly Mary's genealogy. It's interesting that Luke parenthetically says at the beginning of the genealogy that Joseph, some people supposed that he was the father of Jesus. He's basically saying, but Joseph wasn't biologically related to him. Now, while he doesn't say this is Mary's genealogy, the interesting thing is that in that genealogy, he includes some of the same people that were the ancestors of Joseph. For example, King David and Abraham. But there's an important difference. In Luke chapter 3, the genealogy, the source of the genealogy is Adam. In Matthew chapter 1, the source of the genealogy is Abraham. Because Joseph's genealogy went to Abraham because he gave Jesus his legal DNA as a Jew. But it was Mary who descended from the first man, from Adam, who gave Jesus his biological DNA. And he had to be a human. Because even though he could have shown up in the Galilean wilderness and walked around and taught the things he taught and did the things he did, and then disappeared into the wilderness, commissioning his disciples to do what they did, he could have accomplished all of that without being a human. But there was one thing he could not do. What was that? Suffer and die. He had to be a human like you and me, so that he could know and he could show the path through the struggle and the constant battle that life is, so that he could offer himself if he were just an apparition or a figment of spiritual machinations, and he just went through the actions of the cross. Oh no, oh, it hurts so much, stop, don't put the nails in, ow. No, he had to be a human. The author of the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 4, puts it this way. He says, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need, because Jesus was, in fact, just like us. Why Mary and Joseph? Because they were Hebrew, because they were human. And the third thing that I notice from Matthew's story is the controversial one. Why Mary and Joseph? It was because they were ordinary. Now, you may have been raised in a Catholic tradition where Mary is venerated. And the story is told that Mary has even a supernatural origin, much similar to Jesus, and that she is worthy of adoration and veneration. And that's fine if that is your tradition, but you have to understand that Joseph and Mary were just ordinary Galilean kids. That's just who they were. What the story tells us is that they were two kids from Galilee. And what you have to understand about Galileans is that the Judean Jews, the Jews who lived near the temple in Jerusalem, looked down at their noses at the Galileans. The Galileans were the trailer trash of Israel. And they thought that if you were close to God, if you had intimacy with God, favor with God, you physically lived close to the temple. How could a Galilean Jew be close to God when they only came to the temple once a year? I'm a Judean Jew, and I live near the temple, and I go into the temple every day. I'm here for all of the sacrifices and the offerings. I'm close with God because of my geography, because of my proximity. And if the Judean Jews look down their noses at the Galilean Jews look down their noses at anybody from a town like Nazareth. Because Nazareth wasn't even a post office and a gas station. Nazareth was like one of those little towns that you drive through in West Texas where there's a sign and it says the name of the town and then it says population 80, and you drive and you're like, did I just miss the town? Or what? There were maybe a couple houses, but there wasn't anything there. That was Nazareth. Nazareth was a redneck village in the trailer park of Palestine. And Joseph and Mary were kids. They were children. 2,000 years ago, the life expectancy for the average man living in Israel was 40 years. 40 years. That means you got your AARP card when you turned 30. I mean, you were planning your retirement at 35 because you were done at 40. If you lived past 40, you were considered geriatric. And so the culture, they accelerated everything. In fact, they arranged marriages. They couples who had children would find somebody else in their village. You had a son, I have a daughter, let's work things out. And as soon as the daughter was biologically capable of bearing children, they got it on. They got together. They got married. It just happened. So Mary and Joseph, more than likely, were like 14 or 15 years old. What were you like at 14 or 15? You're going to be trusted with the Savior of the world in your care? You can't be trusted with a Pop-Tart. Come on, 14 or 15 years old, Galilean kids. They were ordinary. but they were extraordinary in their character. They were unremarkable people who did remarkable things. It tells us in Matthew's story that when Joseph found out that Mary was pregnant, he decided to protect her. He didn't have to. He had no legal responsibility. In fact, the law gave him permission. If your betrothed, if your fiancé during that pre-marriage season turned up pregnant, that could only mean one thing: she cheated on you. And if you could identify that the person she cheated with was a married man, you could drag her out into the public square and not only shame her, but put her to death. Adultery was a capital crime. And Joseph, as it turns out, is trying to figure out, what do I do? But Joseph was a stand-up guy. You see, Joseph was a good dude. Joseph was a righteous man. And he said, I got to come up with some way to protect this woman. Maybe he thought, she's got a cousin, Elizabeth, who lives down near Jerusalem. I'll send her down there. And she can go down there for the term of her pregnancy before anybody knows. And 9 months later, she'll come back with a baby. And she'll say, it's my cousin's baby. And nobody will know. They don't know her cousin. So maybe he had plans like that. But Joseph decided, I will not do what the law allows. I will protect this woman. We know that he made a decision later in life to protect his family. When the psychopathic despot, ruler Herod, found out that the Messiah, the promised Messiah, had been born in a certain window, in a certain region of Judea, he decided to kill every firstborn child that had been born in that window. So that soldiers went around from house to house checking the age and the birth date of male children, and they killed them. And Joseph said, no, they're not getting my boy. They're not getting my son. And so what did he do? He packed up his family and they went to Egypt. That wasn't like a day trip to Dripping Springs. They went to another country, a country where they were despised, a country where he had no security and no means of making an income. But to protect his son, to protect his family, he made a dramatic decision. We know that throughout the life of Jesus, through his childhood, that his father made sure that he understood the nature of the law. He brought him to Jerusalem for the festivals. He taught him the traditions of his forefathers. And if there's one thing I can tell you with absolute certainty, there is nothing ordinary about a faithful father. Nothing. There is nothing common about a man who steps up to protect his wife and his family and his children, and who raises them with faithfulness and invests in them the faith of his family and his forefathers. There's nothing unremarkable about that. And that was Joseph. But then he disappears. He's gone. We don't know what happens to him. In fact, by the time Jesus goes public, when you think Joseph will be like, there's my boy, there he is, turning the water into wine, healing the blind, listen to him teach. I'm so proud of my son. I knew he was coming. He's gone. Most scholars believe that sometime before Jesus' public ministry, Joseph died. You know what that means? That means Mary was a single mom. That means for part of Jesus' life and for perhaps much of the life of his half-brothers and sisters, Mary raised them alone. Make no mistake about it, there is nothing ordinary about what a single parent does. Nothing. It's like raising a child with one hand tied behind your back. It was something that was never meant to be done alone, and she did it. And she remained faithful. And even though she was confused, and who wouldn't be confused? She's a 13 or 14-year-old girl when she has this child, who she is told is the savior of the world. And throughout his childhood, she'd be looking, oh man, let me see the God thing going on. There are a couple times where she even says, hey son, Can you do a little bit about that God thing? Turn the water into wine. You know, people are asking for it. Can you show your family a little extra love? Like, get us courtside seats, something. And Jesus says to her, Mom, chill out. I know what I'm doing. And she never gave up on him. Never. We know that because she was standing at his feet as he hung on the cross. There is no measure of commitment and love and faithfulness. It is completely remarkable to stand and watch your child die. I don't care whether they're 3 years old, 3 months old, or 33 years old. It doesn't matter. That was her boy. Of course, they were ordinary. They had to be ordinary. You know why they had to be ordinary? Because that's the delight of God. The delight of God is to do extraordinary things through ordinary people. Then there is no mistake about what the source code is. It is God's greatest joy when his ordinary people do extraordinary things. When people without resumes, with people without pedigrees, when people without social standing, unremarkable people do remarkable things. Just like Mary and Joseph. Why Mary and Joseph? Why? Because they were Hebrew. So they could raise their son as a Jew, to fulfill the promises, to live under the law, to follow the Levitical code. They were human, like you and me. And they were ordinary, so that they might demonstrate the extraordinary capacity that all of us have. Why Mary and Joseph? Matthew doesn't say. He doesn't tell us exactly why. But it's interesting that what is perhaps the most significant child ever born, the birth of a person who transformed the course of human history, gets 8 verses. 8 simple verses, that's it. It's a thumbnail sketch of the most significant person ever born. And it starts off in Matthew chapter 1, verse 18. He simply says, this is the story of how Jesus the Messiah was born. There was this dude named Joseph, just a young Galilean kid. And he was pledged through an arranged marriage to be married to this young girl named Mary. And who knew, but Mary turns up pregnant. And they hadn't had sex yet. And Joseph knew whether that had happened. He's like, no. But Joseph was a righteous man. He was a stand-up guy. He was a good dude. And he said, I'm going to protect this woman. And he thought about it. He thought, how can I protect her? How can I cover her up? What can I do to save her? And then he has a dream. And it wasn't just a dream, it was a vision. It was one of those that you never forget. It transcended just, I ate a spicy falafel for dinner. It was one of those things where an angel shows up and says, Joseph, don't be afraid to marry Mary. Don't be afraid of that. Because the child that she is carrying is from God. She's carrying a son. And you will be the one who should name him Yeshua. You should name him Joshua, the name of the deliverer. And all of this is so that you can be part of the fulfillment of a promise that came through the prophet Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14, it says, behold, the miracle of miracles will happen. A virgin will be with child, and she will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. And it simply says that Joseph woke up, and he went and he did everything the angel told him. And he married Mary, and he kept his hands off her for all those months. And she gave birth to the son. And it says simply that Joseph named him Yeshua, Jesus. Maybe the question isn't, why them? Maybe the question is, why not them? See, we ask ourselves the question, why, all the time, and it's a good question, and a lot of times we ask ourselves the question, why me? Why us? Maybe the question we should be asking is, why not us? But I know the question that you really want to answer today is, why, Dave? Why fruitcake? What did fruitcake ever do to you? Why do you have this thing where every Christmas, year after year, you throw the fruitcake under the bus? What is the deal? Let it go. Get over it. Why do you do this year after year? What did fruitcake ever do to you, Dave? Well, I'm going to tell you what fruitcake did to me. Because as a young man, I was assaulted by fruitcake. I was traumatized by fruitcake. See, when Diane and I got married, we were married about a week, we went on a little honeymoon, and then we got in this POS Ford Galaxy that her parents gave us, and we drove from Pennsylvania down to Dallas to start our life together. We both worked a couple of jobs, and we were both in graduate school, and we were trying to make a marriage work, and I got this great job at UPS. And the reason it was a great job was because it paid more than any other job that I had ever had up to that time. It paid $8.80 an hour. And I worked on the midnight shift in what was called the Dallas Hub. Now, the Dallas Hub was up on Walnut Lane, and it was this building that was acres and acres of a warehouse, and it was filled with conveyor belts, 3 stories high. And what would happen every evening, trucks would come in from all over the state, and they would unload the packages that the drivers had picked up during the day, and they would come into the Dallas Hub, and then guys would sort it, and they'd go on all these conveyor belts, and I worked at the end of one conveyor belt where all of the packages that would come to me were going to a certain area, and I had to sort them. I had a slide that went to Dalhart, and I had a slide that went to Abilene, and I had a slide that went to Austin. And as the packages came, turns out you had about 5 or 6 seconds to find the label, know where the address was, and send it to the appropriate truck to be sent out that night. And you were supposed to do 500 or 600 packages an hour sorting them, except at Christmas. Because at Christmas, the place went bonkers. There were packages everywhere. And in between Thanksgiving and probably the second week in December, we would get, from time to time, what were called drop shipments. And drop shipments were when one manufacturer would load up a number of 40-foot semi-trailers with their product and ship them directly to the hub. And so when they got there, you would get hundreds, if not thousands, of packages all at once. And they would be going all over the country. And these drop shipments were annoying. But the worst of the worst came from a place in Corsicana, Texas, called the Collins Street Bakery. And they made fruitcakes. And 2 or 3 times every fall, we'd get 2 or 3 semi-trailers, 40-foot tractor trailer trucks. You know how many of these fit inside a 40-foot semi-truck? If you load it front to back, top to bottom, side to side, thousands of them. And the guys in the hub would just unload them just by the arms full. And they would go out onto the conveyors, and they just like these mountains of fruitcake. Like it was a living thing that was like crawling through the hub. And the problem was there were so many of them that inevitably they'd jam. At the end of one conveyor, before they go to another conveyor, they jam up. So I'd have to climb up, and I'm up in the rafters, and I'm breaking the fruitcake jam. And the belt behind it didn't stop, so it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and I could see them coming. It was like a living monster. I mean, it was in the rafters, 5 feet high, 5 feet wide, thousands of fruitcakes just coming toward me. And they just kept coming and coming and coming. And I'm sorting them and trying to find the address and throwing them. And I'm waist deep in fruitcakes. And there was one time when it was just overwhelming. I was under the pile of fruitcakes. It was terrifying. And I made a vow. While I was under that pile, I said, if I get out of this alive, I am never eating one of these blessed things in my life. So that's why. That's why I will always take cheap shots at fruitcake at Christmas. But what we want to find out is we want to follow the science. And want to see what your excuse is. So hopefully you filled out that survey on menti.com, and we have the results calculated, tabulated here through our technology. So I'm going to share with you what your survey said are the top 5 uses for fruitcake. Number 5 is eat it, which means it's the last thing on the list. And I completely agree with that. If it was a list of 10, it'd be 10. If it was a list of 1,000, it'd be 1,000. What was number 4? What was number 4? Use it as a holiday loofah. You know what a loofah is? You know, it's like an exfoliant for your skin. I think there's enough roughage and fiber in a fruitcake that if you cut off a piece of it and just rubbed it on your face, it would pull off all the dead skin. Plus, you'd smell like Christmas all day long. What was number 3? As a masonry substitute. If your house is out of level, you know it's pier and beam, just jack it up and stick a fruitcake in there. Be good for 1,000 years. All right, number 2, a Yule log, of course. You know those green things? Those aren't cherries. Those are petroleum products. They will burn for hours. So if you don't want to stick the candles in the fruitcake, just light the fruitcake on fire. Burn forever. So number 1 is obviously bury it in the backyard. Because 10,000 years from now, there'll be archaeologists, and they'll be searching, and they'll say, where was this ancient city called Austin? And they'll be digging, and they'll dig, and they'll discover this tin. And they'll open it. And they'll say, what is that? And someone will say, I heard it was said 10,000 years ago that they used to eat it. And they won't believe it. They'll say, no, that's absolutely not possible. And then someone will take a bite of it. And it'll still taste like it does today. And they'll say, no one would eat this. So you, like me, understand scientifically that while fruitcake does not make Christmas, fruitcake helps us have a merry Christmas.